People have this strange idea today that poor means dirty clothes, tiny apartment, no car, no smartphone. That S the old picture. The dangerous thing now is what you might call the new poor. And you know what? S really nasty about this new version. A lot of them look perfectly successful from the outside. Nice car in the driveway, decent income, plenty of posts on social media. But underneath the surface, they one shock away from disaster and they don't even know it. Let me tell you, after almost a century of watching human nature with a calculator in my hand, poverty in the modern world is less about what you earn and more about how you think, how you behave when nobody's watching, and what kind of traps you quietly walk into. I've heard people say, I'm doing okay financially. Then you poke a little, and it turns out they one missed paycheck away from panic, living their whole life on installment plans, and measuring their self-worth by who bought the latest gadget. That's not okay. That's a slow motion train wreck. You see this resignation trap everywhere now. I call it quiet surrender. People say everything's rigged. I'll never get ahead. Why bother? So they stop trying to improve their skills, stop asking hard questions about their money, stop reading anything that isn't entertaining. They've effectively decided their future is hopeless, but they still have to get through every day, so they soothe themselves with consumption, streaming takeout little treats. They not stupid in the IQ sense, they just emotionally exhausted. But the universe doesn't grade on a curve. If you give up, it still compounds against you. I remember the 1970s, inflation, stagnation, bad headlines. A lot of people slipped into that same mindset. Nothing works. The system's broken. ILL just coast. Meanwhile, a smaller group said, all right, the world's ugly right now. What can I still control? They lived under their means when prices were rising. They saved when it felt pointless. They kept learning while everyone else was complaining. Guess who came out the other side with options? It was the clever talkers. It was the dull plotters who refused to resign. Now, let me talk about something you know is a problem, even if you don't like hearing it. Instant gratification. I've watched entire generations get trained to think any discomfort is an emergency. Bored, scroll, sad, buy something, tired, order delivery. Want, swipe a card. The brain gets used to that pattern. It becomes a machine for turning long-term security into short-term stimulation. You might think, well, it's just a latte, it's just one dinner out, it's just one impulse purchase. But those little events are like termites, individually small, collectively devastating. I've always said the big money is not in the buying and selling, but in the waiting. The same applies in your daily life. The ability to wait a day, a week, a month before you gratify a desire is worth a fortune. You don't need superhuman discipline. You just need to slow down the gap between want and act. You see something you want, fine, write it down. Look at it again in 30 days. If it still seems important, maybe you buy it. You'd be astonished how many needs vanish if you force them to survive a little time. Another sign of this new poor problem. People are terrified to talk about money, honestly. They brag about what they bought, where they went, what they earn, sort of, but they won. Tell the truth about their debt, their fears, their ignorance. Money becomes this weird taboo. Couples will lie to each other about credit cards. Parents will shield kids from any discussion of budgeting or investing. It's madness. How can you fix a problem you refuse to name? I remember my father teaching me basic ideas about work and responsibility, not by giving me some formal lecture, but by explaining how the real world treated fools. He didn't hide the fact that life could hurt you. He didn't pretend money was either evil or magical. He acted as if it were something you had to understand, just like gravity. When people treat money like a shameful secret, they guarantee that the next generation will repeat the same dumb mistakes. Now, let's talk about something that really does drive the modern version of poverty. Comparison. I've said for years that the world is driven by greed. It's driven by envy. The basic needs are pretty well filled in rich countries. The real torture now is looking at somebody else who has more bigger house, flashier car, better vacation photos. And instead of saying, good for him, people say, why not me? Then they go out and try to buy the feeling of being equal. Even if the math doesn't say work. When your neighbor buys something, you don't TC his bank statement. You don't TC the anxiety, the loans, the paychecks already spent. You just see the symbol. And symbols are cheap to purchase and terribly expensive to maintain. This is the status symbol prison. The new poor aren't walking around in rags. They walking around with very expensive shackles in the form of financing plans. They repaying monthly for the privilege of impressing people who aren't thinking about them at all. Let me tell you something blunt. The market doesn't care if your friends think you doing well. The bank doesn't care how many compliments you got on your car. Your retirement doesn't care how many likes your vacation photos earned. The only thing that matters in the long run is whether your assets quietly outgrow your liabilities year after year while you sleep. If your public image is going up while your net worth stagnates or declines, you are heading straight into the new poor category, no matter how good it looks from the sidewalk. You know what else keeps people trapped? Emotional spending. They not buying because they thought things through. They rebuying to change how they feel lonely. Shop angry, shop tired of feeling small, buy something big. It's the same pattern you see in any addiction, temporary relief, followed by regret, followed by more of the same behavior to escape the regret. And just like other addictions, it is terribly profitable for everyone except the addict. I remember a lot of people in the real estate boom years who bought bigger houses than they needed, not because they had a growing family, but because they had a shrinking sense of self. They wanted to feel like they made it. Then when interest rates moved, or their job hiccuped, the whole thing turned into a nightmare. They didn't get foreclosed because they were bad people. They got foreclosed because they treated money as medicine instead of as a tool. Now, this installment illusion nonsense, it has become a defining feature of the new poor. Everything S on payments. A car isn't a price. It S a monthly. A phone isn't a device. It S a plan. Furniture, vacations, clothes, if it exists, someone will find a way to chop it into little monthly chunks and sell it to you as affordable. And you know something? Each individual payment is affordable. That's the genius of it. But the system counts on you looking at each one in isolation instead of adding them up. If you sat down and wrote out every recurring payment in your life, you might faint. The subscriptions you forgot, the services you barely use, the only $30 a month, deals that multiplied like rabbits. The new poor Dante get crushed by one giant bill. They get squeezed to death by 100 small ones. By the time they notice, their entire income is pre-committed. Payday arrives and the money passes through their hands like water. They just a relay station for other people. Business models. Speaking of payday, one of the clearest signs you slipping into this trap is that your emotions revolve around the calendar. You feel rich on Friday and broke by the end of the month. You decline social invitations not because you wise and selective, but because your checking account is in intensive care. Your whole nervous system is tuned to the rhythm of deposits and debits. That is not freedom. That is wage slavery with better branding. I've always thought that one of the most underrated luxuries in life is not having to check your bank balance before you make a routine decision. I don't mean reckless spending. I mean the mental calm of knowing that a random car repair or a medical bill isn't going to topple your entire life. The new poor Dante have that calm, even when they earn what previous generations would have called a handsome income, because they never built any buffer. They live in a perpetual edge condition. Now, let's talk about dependence. If every dollar you live on comes from one employer, one profession, one fragile income stream, and you made no effort to build alternatives, you in a very risky position. You might have a beautiful title, a fancy office, and a business card that impresses people at parties. But if a single decision in a room you not in can erase your income, you are economically fragile. no matter how high your salary is. I'm not saying everyone has to become an entrepreneur, that romantic nonsense. But I am saying that putting all of your life, oxygen into one hose, is not wise. Over a long life, industries change. Technologies destroy old roles and create new ones. Entire sectors go from prosperous to pitiful in a decade. If you behave as if your current good fortune is permanent, you are setting yourself up for a very harsh chapter later. Another thing that defines this new poor class is what I call the hamster wheel syndrome. These are people who are working very hard, sometimes brutally hard, and yet their situation never fundamentally improves. They get a raise, their lifestyle rises faster. They work overtime, the money evaporates. They tell themselves they busy building a future, but if you freeze the frame every 5 years, nothing truly changes except the size of their obligations. I've never been impressed by hustle for its own sake. Activity is not the same as progress. If you expending enormous effort and not increasing your margin of safety, your savings, your skills, your options, you not building wealth, you just burning calories. The new poor can be very industrious. They just never escape the cycle because they never step back far enough to redesign the cycle. Let me tell you what might be the cruelest part. Ignorance tax. I don't mean tax codes. I am talking about the price you pay for not understanding how money actually works. High interest on debt, bad investment products, full of fees, scams dressed up as opportunities, costly mistakes made because people judge by vibes instead of by numbers. The less you know, the more you bleed, and the bleeding is continuous. I've said for years that in my whole life, I've known no wise people who didn't read constantly. None, zero. You don't have to be a genius. But if you refuse to spend a few hours a week learning basic financial ideas, how compounding works, what a balance sheet means, how to read an account statement, you're volunteering to pay the ignorance tax for the rest of your life. That's your choice. But don't call it bad luck. And then there's last sign, you only talk about money when there's a crisis. Rent due and you short. Debt collectors call. Something breaks and you can pay for it. Suddenly, everyone wants to have a serious discussion. Then the storm passes, and it's back to silence and denial. That's not a plan. That's emotional triage, A family that only talks about health after the heart attack is headed for more hospital visits. A person who only looks at their car after it breaks down will spend a lot of time on the side of the road. Money is the same. If the only time you look it in the eye is when it's on fire, you be living in a state of constant emergency. Now, let me pull this together and tie it to what you really worried about. The future. You're looking at inflation, at strange markets, at debt levels, at all the nonsense that passes for financial news, and you're rethinking, what if 2026 is some kind of disaster? What if things break? Well, I've got news for you. Something will break, maybe in 2025. Maybe in 2027, maybe in some year no one is talking about. The timing doesn't matter as much as your structure. One of the great defenses against inflation and chaos is not having a lot of silly needs in your life. If you don't require a huge, fragile lifestyle to feel okay, then rising prices and temporary volatility hurt you less. If your idea of a good life is modest, focused more on relationships and interesting work than on consumption, then your cost structure becomes your secret weapon. If we did get a period in the late 2020s that looks like some of the nastier patches I've lived through, high uncertainty, scary headlines, assets repricing in ways that make nervous people sick, you see the difference very sharply. The new poor, with their invisible chains of payments, envy, and ignorance, would get crushed. They have no buffer, no second leg to stand on. No understanding of what's happening. They sell good assets at bad prices. They cling to status symbols while their future evaporated. Meanwhile, the quietly prudent, people who ignored envy, kept expenses low, learned enough to avoid the worst stupidity, saved consistently, and built their lives on something sturdier than consumption, would bend, but they wouldn't break. They might feel uncomfortable, Everyone does in bad times. But they still be standing when the dust settled. In fact, they likely come out ahead because crises transfer wealth from the overextended to the prepared. The whole point of pointing out these 12 signs isn't to shame you. It's to give you a mirror you can fix what you want to admit. If you hear these patterns, living for payday, buying to impress, drowning in payments, avoiding financial knowledge, and you recognize yourself, that's not the end of the story. That's the start of the turnaround. Let me leave you with something very simple. You don't have to be brilliant. You don't have to predict 2026. You don't have to outsmart Wall Street. You just have to stop insisting on carrying all 12 of these anchors at once. Drop a few, then drop a few more. Spend a little less than you earn. Learn a little more than you knew last year. Want a little less than your neighbor. Do that over and over for the rest of your life. You know what that makes you in this modern world? Not flashy, not trendy, but rich, quietly, solidly, and in a way that no headline can take away from you.